Welcome. In this short video, I'd like to shed some light on CLIMADA, the open source and access risk assessment adaptation options appraisal platform in action, in particular its application to the San Salvador case study. Two things to note. Number one, there is a specific recording directed by Dr. Mauricio Paul, who looks into the case more in detail. And there is also another piece which basically introduces the embracing method, the economics of climate adaptation in more detail. And there's yet another one which describes CLIMADA more in a conceptual fashion. But here, let's dive into what's behind the model and how does a very particular application look like. My name is David Bresch, Professor for Weather and Climate Risk at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH Zurich in Switzerland. I've developed CLIMADA more than a decade ago. I started to build this open source model in order to allow all kinds of actors to get access to a state-of-the-art risk assessment platform, independent of where they are on the planet and what kind of data they have. So it's a very versatile tool implemented in Python. Links to be followed in a second. What does CLIMADA provide? It does in essence provide a better understanding of climate risk as the first step in developing an effective adaptation strategy. So it provides decision makers with a fact base to develop their own adaptation strategy. And in essence, to do so, it answers these three key questions, which are the key questions normally asked in an economics of climate adaptation effort. Number one, what are our climate risks today and in the coming decades? How can we deal with these risks and which adaptation measures are most appropriate? And last but not least, which investments are necessary and do the benefits, means the risk reduction of these measures, outweigh the cost, means the cost of implementing those efforts. In the specific case of San Salvador, we look at flood and landslide risk and apply exactly this method and this underpinning engine in such an economics of climate adaptation study. As mentioned, more details on the link is provided below, which is a technical report. And I should also mention, this has not been, couldn't have been done without many very strong partners as listed on the right. So first, the fact is, if you switch on the heat, water begins to boil. That's thermodynamics, the same in a climate system. A warming planet does lead to change in the dynamics, but there is a lot of uncertainty. Where will turbulence exactly occur? So where will risk manifest itself very specifically? And therefore, regarding impacts, it's the weather, not the general climate, that matters first and foremost, not least in adaptation decision-making. And that's why weather risk is the guiding concept. And that's the concept behind CLIMADA. What's risk? In essence, is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So if you don't know where you want to go, it's hard to talk about risk. But as soon as you'd like to achieve something, then you can figure what are uncertainties for me reaching that objective, that goal, and therefore that lends itself to a further study. One way to frame risk is normally to say it's the sum kind of the product, and in essence, it's a convolution of probability distributions and severity distributions, but keep it simply. It's basically say, what's the likelihood of something to happen, probability, and what's the severity of the impact, good or bad? It could be gain, it can be loss, and economists often talk about the expected utility, and then they would sum around that and call that then the sum of expected utilities, which would form a solid economic framework for decision making. Now, in the natural catastrophe weather impact space, we often deal with hazard hitting some exposure, be it people or assets, at a certain type of vulnerability, and that constitutes risk. Now we can sort that back into this general equation and say the hazard contains the probability. How often is a severe flood hitting the city of San Salvador, and at what intensity in terms of water depth, for example? What's the exposure there? Who is living there under which conditions? And that leads to the vulnerability side of things. An interesting remark, probability is very much embedded on the hazard side of this equation and lends itself to natural science type of scrutiny. And the more you move on the severity side to the right on this panel, you get into the vulnerability, more social science, socio-economic type of aspects. So the risk as presented here does basically marry natural science and social science approaches into a consistent framework. How does that now look like? So watch the propeller on the right, and on the left, on the next slide, you see it center stage. It's basically that CLIMADA combines, say, a flood footprint as a representation of a weather event with the specific exposure, say, assets and people living in these places in San Salvador and their respective vulnerability, which is a link between how deep the flood is, just to stick to the flood example here, and how severe the impact therefore might be. Now in the center, and that's why it's called a probabilistic event-based simulation, means it doesn't do that for only one single flood footprint, and that's a bit hard to show on static slide. It does it for thousands of possible flood events that might happen in that particular place. So it simulates many, many hundreds of thousands of flood events on a particular set of assets, be it people or houses or infrastructure in general, and then it looks at their respective vulnerability. Outputs, therefore, are solid basis, a type of a risk analysis and risk mapping. And for one example, you can show what's the risk today, how it might change over time. I'm coming to that in a second, and what would constitute risk, say, by 2040. And that would be definitely a solid basis to think about adaptation. But as you might remember from the economics of climate adaptation presentation, it doesn't stop there. It's then also about what you can do about that. But first things first, let's look how this model does quantify risk today. So the hazard component, a flood map, a flood intensity, flood water depth in the Azuate River in San Salvador, which can reach up to 4 meters of water depth. You see the resolution of the high resolution hazard, and then the inset over the lower left, that's the gray area is the whole municipal area of San Salvador, and the river in black is the larger piece enlarged here on the main map. So that constitutes one single hazard event, for example, a 1 in 100-year type of a flood scenario. The other ingredient, exposure and vulnerability, has been mapped meticulously with partners on the ground. So the different colors signify different type of building values, reconstruction values, and you see that the differences in both the locations and the wealth of people behind that. And so we mapped that all out and basically expose now people and assets to this type of a flood hazard as shown before. And that allows us to quantify on the left the damage to houses. The numbers will be explained by Mauricio Paul in much more detail in a separate presentation, but you can also look at the impact on people, that's on the right. So on average, long-term average, 140 people are affected today by flood events on average. This doesn't mean every year there's 140 people severely affected. That doesn't mean it's casualties, but there are, for example, have to temporarily relocate and so on. No, it just means that there are many years that nothing is happening, and a couple of years there's a lot happening, and on average that's the number. But for many risk management decisions, it's an interesting metric to look at what's the general risk level in a particular place. Now, we can not only use this scenario framework, CLIMADA, for a specific situation today, we can also input development scenarios. We can figure how would that change? Where would people likely live in a decade or two from now, say by 2040? And we can rerun the whole simulation, but now including economic development. And you see on the left, there's a tremendous increase in risk due to economic development. There's just more stuff around there. But there's a good news, and that's on the right. It's only a tiny increase in people being affected. That's because that development takes current flood risk levels into account. So people are building in places where they kind of think that it might work out over the midterm. But that's the picture, just risk today plus economic development. And now, in addition, you can also put in this CLIMADA framework climate scenarios. You can change frequency and intensity of specific flood events and look at what the impact that might have on the general risk landscape. You now see that there is an increase due to climate change on both the asset as well as on the people side, and it's kind of substantial in both cases. And that means there should be something done about. And the most interesting piece is not how big the red bar is, but what can you do to reduce it? So the greenish arrow, how can you bring risk levels down to a tolerable level, a level people are used to deal with? And basically, this is the number 2 question, the second question in this whole thing, what you can do about risks. So in the particular case in San Salvador, and they left the transparency in Spanish to show it was a deep engagement with many workshops on the ground to figure what can you all do about in order to reduce risk on the ground. I'm not going into detail, but basically if that to the presentation of Mauricio Paul. Now, in the same framework, you can introduce this, what we call often adaptation options or resiliency measures. For example, better prevention, spatial planning, better building codes and building qualities into this engine and say, what if we build differently? What effect does that have on flood impacts and flood risks? Therefore, means you can use this tool to appraise resiliency measures and options and look at their effectiveness in terms of reducing flood risk. And if you then put also in the cost of implementing those measures, you can then look at benefit cost ratios and figure what's the most effective particular measure to reduce flood risk, to stick to that example in that particular case. And last but not least, it also lends itself to uncertainty quantification, as you can run the model with different parameters. You often say you can wiggle all the different parameters, turn all the knobs in this engine and see what has a big impact and what not so much, and there you get the feel for the robustness of your results, which goes beyond the scope of this presentation, but just to mention. So the output will be an adaptation cost curve. So you will see on the horizontal axis the averted damage, so the reduction in impact, and on the vertical axis you see the benefit for each dollar spent. So if you look at that for ecological restoration, you see the drainage, relief channel, and ecological restoration can protect up to 4,500 people until 2040. So note, on the horizontal axis, it's not dollars. It's basically how many people you do not or will not be affected under the assumption that we put some of these measures in place. And the vertical axis, what does it cost to basically better protect these people? But as I mentioned, more details in the presentation from Mauricio Paul. Similarly, you can do that, and now the horizontal axis is in dollars for assets. You can look at what kind of assets are affected by flood, and you learn that ecological restoration, absorption wells, and urban planning are very powerful measures to reduce flood risk in the particular case of San Salvador and the situation I've shown before. So order of about 200 million of assets are at risk from flooding until 2040, but you basically see there are a lot of measures of interventions you could take in order to reduce that. So if you look at the horizontal axis, in fact, you would, had you a lot of money at your disposal, be able to tremendously reduce flood risk. And there are a couple measures which are very powerful, as mentioned, and you can also chart them out geographically. So that's now a graphical rendering, the same region as shown before when I showed you the flood hazard map, and as well as the exposure and vulnerability chart, a kind of map. This is now the benefit. You see the red dots. It's probably a bit counterintuitive, but the red dots are places where you have tremendous benefit for each dollar invested into ecological restoration on especially upper catchment area will have tremendous benefit downstreams. Up to $200 you save by investing $1 in protective measures. So this is a clear case for action, and it also blends itself with the notion that most cases in the adaptation airspace, it's absolutely worth taking action. It's normally cheaper than sit and wait for the future and to learn it the hard way. But it doesn't come for free, and it needs an upfront engagement with a situation which is very likely to aggravate over time. And so we've seen that CLIMADA does, in this economics of climate adaptation framework, provide on, if you start on the right, hazard type of information, more, I would say, academically digestible information in a very detailed and meticulous fashion. Then it does, as shown in the center, provide us with this, what we often call waterfall charts, to say what's the risk today, economic development, climate change, and what constitutes risks, say 2-3 decades from now, which is definitely an interesting piece of information for decision makers and policy making too. And last but not least, and that's on the lower left, that's the graphical rendering of these adaptation cost curves, basically providing you with the benefit cost information for specific actions you might want to take. And that's very helpful, especially for also those institutions financing and ultimately implementing and maintaining these measures, so they have this information at their disposal. And since I mentioned a couple times the economics of climate adaptation, how does that all come together? So basically, CLIMADA is the engine underpinning these efforts. So you basically, in a particular region, run an economics of climate adaptation effort. That's a stakeholder engagement process where you use this number crunching engine to provide the numbers as shown before. And they allow decision makers, last but not least, to unlock climate finance, but also to first develop their national adaptation plans and other regional, local, urban, for example, adaptation strategies. There is a network forming, that's the link in the center, on the clickable one on the lower left, where basically we try to bundle forces and join forces to basically push for these efforts, not least such that over time we will take better informed adaptation decisions. Brings me to the end, only to mention, for the wider context, the economics of climate adaptation, there's a guidebook for practitioners which helps you to explore whether such an approach makes sense in your particular case, offers then a step-by-step guide to practically execute, and enables the project team very much to engage with stakeholders early on, because shaping and framing these studies is absolutely key to success. And then, as said before, these efforts are underpinned by the open source and access CLIMADA engine. And with that, I'm at the end of my short presentation, a bit under the hood of CLIMADA, and I'd like to thank many of my collaborators, and I do think we made a bit of a difference to local adaptation and strengthening societal resilience on the ground, and I'm deeply grateful to all these colleagues who helped us push in that direction. With that, thanks for your attention.